there were so many ideas for the next panel, it was awfully hard to find a subject that would cover them all. So the group finally decided on the one that is on your program, Living and Learning. Participants in the discussion will be the delegates from Denmark, Korea, Switzerland, Germany, Iceland, and maybe one or two others. If you'll come up, we'll hear, will members of this panel please come up to the microphone, and we'll hear first from Gudrun Erlendsdottir from Iceland. Gudrun?
When I was a little girl, I thought Iceland was the centrum of the universe. Of course, I knew that there existed big countries and continents, as for instance, America, Asia, and Africa. Oh, but they were so terribly far away that in my eyes they were another world. But this opinion of mine was disturbed in the World War II, because then I saw foreigners for the first time in my life. And how surprised I was that they looked just like Icelanders. But when I got the chance to come over here, I was overfilled with joy and thankfulness, but also scared. I didn't know what to expect. And when I arrived here, I was even still more scared and confused. Everything was so big, the speed was so great. In the first weeks, I had a hard struggle with myself, because in my heart, I was filled with envy over everything new I saw, and I wouldn't admit that the new things I saw were good. But when I saw the friendliness of the people, something melted within me, and everything was in motion, so that I couldn't reach to any conclusion. It is a strange feeling to be a foreign delegate. The time when we sit in the car with our new host family is both awful and wonderful. We are longing to be a good representative of our country, but at the same time we want to get to know the family we are going to live with. Is it a typical American family? Will it be like home? For me it always was, so usually everything goes well.
In these 3 months I have lived an American life somewhat more eventful than the average, and definitely a great deal more strenuous. I have enjoyed all sides of your life, including what I consider an indecent amount of television. As a result of my experiences, I find that really you are not very much different from young people I know at home. But the funny thing is that a lot of American teachers and parents seem to think you are. They keep saying that you are not nearly as serious and industrious as young Europeans. Of course, I have noticed a few differences. Young people over here are more money-minded than at home. One of the commonest subjects of your conversation seems to be how to get a job. And I was surprised as a European to find this even in the wealthiest communities. This is one reason why I find it so absurd when your parents claim that you are less responsible than we are. You have very often the full responsibility of spending the money you earn. And also, it seems to me that the considerably more freedom you have in your relationship to the opposite sex must give you a very great responsibility.
Living among you, I was struck, first of all, by your dance parties, your dating, most of which I consider a waste of time, and the over-publicized juvenile delinquency. But we are getting an entirely wrong picture of America if we fail to see the responsibility and cooperation you show in your school and community life. I stress this because I'm ashamed to say I failed to see it at first. I thought you did whatever you wanted to and took nothing seriously. My host objected. He mentioned a play in the assembly that morning. He said, if any of the 40 people in it had goofed, the whole show would have gone wrong. But everybody met the requirement for practice and cooperation with a strong sense of responsibility. Since I thought I had been eager and open-minded to observe about American teenagers, I was shocked to find myself incapable of understanding such a basic fact. It was interesting, too, that my host had never thought about this until my criticism prompted him to defend and explain it.
Another thing I like here is the informal way in which you seem to visit each other. You just drop in and say hi, and in case you are hungry, you plunder the refrigerator. At home, when we have a party and invite 20 people, 10 come. Here you invite 20 people and 40 show up. One of my host mothers told me that she never knows how many people she's going to have for lunch nor for supper. And one morning, she suddenly found that she had 3 extra persons for breakfast, one of whom had slept on the floor, whereas the 2 others materialized from nowhere. I came over here with traditional European prejudices, that you lack culture and that you are exclusively interested in sports, dating, and mechanics. When I had been in a few English classes, I realized that at least you are exposed to culture. That you possess it, I did not realize until one night at a party. It began like almost any teenage party here, crowded, noisy, and rather dull. But suddenly, everybody found him or herself involved in a violent discussion about religion, philosophy, and a lot of other things I had never dreamt you would be able to say a single word about.
In our schools, we learn that Americans have not yet started to produce a culture of their own. The first day I walked around in Washington, I was very much inclined to believe so. The planning was French, the capital was after Italian Renaissance, the Supreme Court was Greek, the National Gallery was Greek and Roman together. There was no distinctive character. Architecture, however, to my mind, is a way of expressing ourselves as well as paintings, music, or literature. New York, I think, in this way, expresses American life. Skyscrapers, highways, bridges, and especially light are important factors of this American culture. For my feeling, crossing the Hudson River and looking at the silhouette of Manhattan by night is one of the most beautiful things I ever saw, comparable to the most famous art places in Europe. And it is typical for this country. You won't find it anywhere else on earth.
Well, I would go one step further and say that Americans are changing the concept of culture itself. You mentioned, Guy, New York skyscrapers. According to our old standards, Asian and European, it would be a misuse of the word to say that they express the culture of America. So many aspects of American life, which are truly part of your culture, would not be described by that term anywhere else. Jazz, for example. I'm inclined to call it noise, not music. And I know that people with all cultural backgrounds would agree with me. But so far as it means something to you and you enjoy it, and so far as it does express emotion through sound, we cannot question the fact that it is music. As such, it is part of the new American culture. Sport is another example. Here, sport is more than recreation. It is almost a religion. Perhaps it is because you have learned to be Americans instead of merely a mixture of Poles, Italians, Germans, and Britons through sports, which concentrate on the strong, victorious team, regardless of the race, national background, social position, or wealth of the champion. Europeans and Asians may object to calling it culture, but it is a new culture this brave young nation has created. Perhaps not too much to the taste of the people from old traditional cultures, like myself, but we are watching its progress with admiration and curiosity.
Speaking of this new concept of culture in America, I have been struck by the difference in the nature of religious life here. First of all, Americans are considerably more concerned about religion than most Europeans. When I told somebody here that one of the delegates in our group is an atheist, he said he was afraid that delegate would not be able to get along with the Americans. I think one important reason for this your greater interest in religion is that in fact an American church is an enterprise, more or less in competition with a lot of other churches, so to say, to get customers. The interesting thing about it is that the customer becomes a stockholder. The American feels that the church he goes to is his church, and as a result, most of the very formal awe-inspiring atmosphere of a European church where people worship anonymously disappears. The American church is a religious and social club, a place where you first attend services, but also play basketball, dance, and visit with your neighbors at so-called covered dish suppers. Now I understand better the amazement of the Americans towards atheism. It seems, in fact, to me that you are more willing to tolerate the most peculiar form of religion than no religion at all.
I wanted to say something a moment ago when you were talking about Americans' warmth and friendliness. Already in my first weeks here, I found out that Americans are friendlier than Europeans. Host parents take themselves out to so much trouble over us. I, for instance, know a mother who came all the way from New Jersey to Bronxville to make sure that her forum guest kept on getting the typhoid injections he started to get at her house. Here's another example of that what I mean. If you, for instance, meet a friend on the street in Germany and ask him, "How are you?" he'll always tell you that he has a headache or that he couldn't sleep very well last night. A typical answer is, "Oh, I wish I would be better." Here in America, you'll never find something like this. Everyone is always fine and wonderful.
This cordiality is certainly the American characteristic that impressed everybody, including me, the most. But for a time, I thought that another characteristic about you was informality and a certain gaiety. I remember once I mentioned it to an American teacher when we talked about the well-known European mask of formality. And I said I found that Americans were more natural. But she answered me, the American mask is one of informality and gaiety.
Your friendliness towards all of us delegates makes me sometimes wonder if you realize how critical we are in Europe towards any foreigner. It's not only again towards Americans, but as well towards Englishmen traveling in France or Germans in Italy or Swiss people in France. In all these European languages, the words for stranger have some hostile meaning. They designate a kind of doubtful and unknown person. In America, the word is full of friendliness. I would even say that you find the thing more attractive just because it is foreign. For example, when I asked my host to correct my English, I used to say, "Why do you want to change it? It makes it so much nicer." Or an American lady told me that the American men go crazy about a woman just because she has a foreign accent. This attitude toward the foreigner is one I never met before. Perhaps it offers a new insight in this American culture we were just talking about. This American culture might not be based, as in Europe, on the individual genie, but more on cooperation of the whole nation. Your schools already show this difference. While our schools try to emancipate the individual, you want to make him a good citizen of the whole country. If we had a National Citizens Commission for public schools which put up slogans in subways, they would say, "Better schools, better individuals." Your slogans, however, say, "Better schools, better communities." As a result, if you consider a whole nation, you can say that the United States are composed of so many million people, while we, unfortunately, in Europe, we are divided in so many million of people. I hope that in some time United States will have an influence back on Europe and help us to compose our divisions. In political life, it happened that we have lost, in many cases in Europe, the trust and the faith in our governments, while you here have it very, very strongly, and in some way cultivated in your schools too.
I want to question your praise of the way American high schools teach history, or so-called social studies. I am a believer in democracy myself, but still I do not like to hear that the primary purpose of a history course is to create a social democratic climate. And this is, in fact, a direct quote from the outline of an American history course in one of my host schools. History is probably the most misused of all sciences, and I object to its misuse whether committed by Russians, Germans, Danes, or Americans. Having said this, I'd like to make two more points. One of the things I have noticed in your schools is that while your textbooks have basically the same contents, they are generally about 3 times as fat. What makes the difference are all the pictures, maps, and whole sections showing the practical use or topical interest of the theoretical contents. The American high school has a much bigger window facing the outside world than ours do. Secondly, the American high school is very much concerned about the arts as means of human expression, an aspect of life which our higher schools completely neglect. In my opinion, in these two respects, your schools have an absolute advantage over ours.
Eric, you just mentioned citizenship taught in high schools. That is something what I noticed especially too. Learning about the own government and discussing current events is the best way, or at least the beginning of the way that leads to being a good citizen. But not only this, it seems to me also as if you use ceremonial to teach citizens. I was wondering why in most schools the students say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. As soon as something becomes to be a ritual, it begins to lose its meaning for you, no matter how proud you are in being Americans and how much you love your country.
I never had such a wonderful feeling streaming through me as when I attended an assembly in American high school for the first time. When I stood there on the stage and looked over the auditorium on the students saying the Pledge of Allegiance and singing the Star-Spangled Banner, something happened. I cannot describe it, but I saw how much you love your country and your democracy.
This is Pat Sanford from the United Kingdom to put in a word.
I want to put a word in here, because when I came here first, I was extremely critical of your ceremonies in high school assemblies, the anthem singing and the pledge to the flag. I even remarked that they seemed to have an almost totalitarian overtone. But I began to change my mind when I visited an American family in which there was a rigidly British grandmother who still thought British ways were best, although she'd been here for over 40 years. This made me realize how difficult it is for people coming from different countries to adapt to the American way of life. Now I think America has really done so much in so little time. This is where American education has been very successful. If the grandmother I spoke of had been to high school here, perhaps she would have felt differently.
Thank you, Pat. And this is ZF from Vietnam.
American schools not only make good citizens, they help the individual to develop their own personality. Before I came here, all my relations gave me many advices. They said, keep quiet, don't talk, just listen to what others say. If anybody talks to you, just say yes, 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 whether you believe what they say or not, because it is not polite to disagree. Naturally, when I first arrived here, I was very, very shy. I didn't know how to make a decision for myself, and I was so afraid of everything. I stayed in bed most of the first week, and I was so scared, because I was so scared to do anything else. Then, in my first high school, I was asked to talk in an assembly before 600 people. I either have to get over my shyness or die from the shock.
But Jeff, I think sometimes we can overdo it. I was terribly shocked when at the Barnard Forum a girl of 18 in a prepared speech declared that parents should not interfere with the decisions of the children, but they always should be available when the children ask them for any advice. I think that this situation relegates the parents to a kind of an alarm clock. Instead of a family group where the whole family listens to when the father talks, here the child is in the center and everybody listens to him. I prefer our system where we are born into an already existing world and we have to adjust to it, while here the world is remained around the child as soon as he is born.
When I see poor American parents begging their children to be so merciful as not to interrupt, I just wonder why they don't just tell them to shut up once and for all.
When I asked parents here why they give up so much for their children, they always explained, we want our children to have as much fun as they can while they are young. It seems to me as if behind this lies the old Puritan tradition, play when you play, work when you work. It's all right to enjoy life as long as you are young, but after 25, all life is duty and hard work.
Maybe your parents are partly to blame that you don't like to be alone. One American boy I met was a better than average student, but like most of his friends, he felt uneasy when alone or when everything was quiet. When he gets up, he turns on the radio and lets it make a disturbing noise without paying any attention to it. Without the radio, he says, he feels uneasy, seized by an indescribable feeling, which I think is akin to horror, that he is alone. One night, after we had been to a play, at about 9 o'clock, he said, "Gee, I don't know where to go. It's too early to go home." He had wonderful parents, an air-conditioned house with a room of his own, and a TV set, a gramophone, and hundreds of books. Here he was with all this and time to relax, but he did not know where to go. It is therefore not totally unreasonable for me to doubt whether all of you are as happy as you say so confidently that you are. To make a generalization, you just cannot help liking somebody, and you cannot live without being liked by somebody. And in many cases, you cannot help being like somebody. You seem especially eager to conform to the standard of your society. However, there are ample reasons to believe that if a person does not conform, he will face a tough pressure. I felt this pressure when I was told that silence and modesty are not signs of a healthy boy. Of course, DF's experience shows how we also, in Asia, can be tyrannized by the need to conform. But don't both kinds of pressure have the same basic effect of curbing the freedom of the individual? Of course, you are happy with and proud of the freedom you have here. But man's long progress toward freedom does not mean political freedom alone. It means freedom to be himself. In my opinion, one of the greatest problems facing mankind is to find fuller opportunity to develop our personalities without losing the benefit and cooperative spirit of the community. In this, I find a big weakness in American freedom and individualism. The rule of the average, of mediocrity, can be as tyrannical as that of any tyrant. I have had to think about this deeply. In Korea, we have had to review our old values, especially since the war, which made us doubt what we had taken for granted. The change it brought in our way of living and thinking is a part of the change that began almost a century ago, and not only in Korea. It began with the meeting of East and West. War simply made it more drastic. You see, ours was a conservative, feudalistic, and patriarchal system, quite different from democracy. But order was maintained in that way. Culture flourished on that basis. And truly, there are some invaluable beauty and goodness in children respecting the wisdom of age, in the politeness and modesty of the people. And I think the devotion and earnestness with which people lived are highly praiseworthy. Then came the contact with the West. We adopted many Western ways, including democracy. But when those who knew only to say yes to the superior tried to be citizens of a democratic country, plenty of troubles came. They say when a person encounters a new thing, he learns its bad points sooner than its good. Before learning the cooperation and voluntary self-restraint of democracy, many lost themselves in the chaos, which is a defect of democracy. Moreover, our reason was confused by the violence and misery were brought, and our self-confidence is wavering. The change also invaded the calm and peace of Orientals. For centuries and centuries, we were content with what we had, indifferent to social progress. In short, we have lost our old values and haven't found the new ones yet. And this moral and ethical vacuum created in the minds of our young people is the most important item on our reconstruction program. Our future is uncertain, but after 3 months of living and learning in America, I have found additional courage to face the uncertainty.